I'm going to start by looking at the impact COVID has had worldwide. And this is going to connect to the data and where we're going with education. When you look at the UNESCO map here, you're going to see on March 1st, 2020, basically 6 countries had countrywide closures. I want you to look at this in next slide. This is now 194 countrywide closures. That's in a month. We in the United States are looking right now at whether we return to education in the fall, whether it be K through 12, whether it be higher education. And I think all of Dr. Kaufman's work, especially looking at children, there are so many things we need to think about. We're going to be talking about higher education. There's implications as well as for K through 12, but we're going to be looking at learning in the brain. I wish I could go on. It's been like an extra 20 minutes just talking about the effects of stress on the brain in academic performance, but we're just going to focus on this short time period. So in March 2020, basically everything moved to remote learning. And what to understand is we didn't have a plan. It just happened. And for teachers, we need to think about how that affects their work, cognitive load, students who weren't prepared, who were suddenly shifted. And now we've got to start planning ahead. And I know there's a lot of talk simply about the fall. What do we do this fall? I believe it's going to be beyond the fall. If you listen to the projections that are being shared nationally and internationally, it sounds like later in the fall, it could potentially get worse, which again has ramifications on the winter, even possibly early spring. So where there are challenges, there are also opportunities. There's a lot of conversation about the new normal. What's the new normal going to look like? Well, I'm suggesting we don't go back to normal because I really don't think as a global society, we were ever simply homogeneous and normal. We have got so much diversity. And what I would recommend, we take this time and collectively come together, like at this KIE conference, and we have an educational reset. And we look at transformative education, and we make it informed. And we really take creativity and innovation and put it at the heart of what we're trying to do planning going forward, not simply planning for next month, but planning for this generation and the next generation of students. So when coronavirus hit, I will tell you as an educator, my expertise is in online and blended learning. I've been talking about online and blended learning, even did a publication about 10 years ago that talked about this progressive shift. Well, things happened overnight. And if you're familiar with Jack Mesereau's work, he talks about 10 phases of transformative learning. I will tell you, as somebody who loves educational theory, we are in the midst of transformative learning, and we have to embrace it. So when we look at the disruption that's happened on a national level, things we need to think about, the 10 phases start with the dilemma, but this is on multiple levels. We have a dilemma in terms of what's happened within education, what's happened within our workforce, what's happened nationally, internationally, but it's also what's happening to us individually as educators, as researchers, our students. And we have to really think about how this is challenging our beliefs, our assumptions, and our attitudes. And some of the research that's out there, if you look at research on emotional contagion and the fact that when you're looking at mimicry and stress and how that can increase stress in others, as educators, we need to find ways to embrace this as an opportunity, again, through the lens of creativity and innovation, to help our students, to help our employees understand we can do it collectively. So it starts with self-examination, and we're going to start with that today. Critical assessment. Then it's recognition. So for faculty that have always taught face-to-face, is there discontent? Probably. I wasn't trained to teach online. I don't want to teach online. Well, the reality is going into the future, most faculty and teachers will have to be prepared to teach some aspects of their courses online. So how do we embrace that? How do we look at this process of transformation and make it as shared, where we're doing it collectively? We start redefining our new roles and we look at knowledge and skills. How do we learn to work in this new transformative education era? We have to come up with our plan in terms of our course of action. And more importantly, and this is where I think Dr. Reisman does just such a brilliant job with our students, as well as Dr. Kaiser, we need to explore options collectively, looking at it through different lenses, roles, relationships, actions. And then what do? We build confidence in ourselves and those that we're working with, so all stakeholders are moving forward together collectively. And then it's reintegration. It's what we know, it's what we do well. So it's a shift, you know, and we talk about new mindset, new results. So right now we are at the heart of opportunities for innovation. And so what I want everybody to think about is this concept of pivotal pedagogy. I know Dr. Kaiser and I presented on this earlier, but it cuts across education. It cuts across training. It cuts across everything that we know, and it will relate to the data that I share. But it looks at teaching and learning and focuses on active engagement. But more importantly, it doesn't matter the modality that we're teaching. We have to think about instruction, active learning, assessment, and what might be new is alternative equivalencies. If this is the magic in my classroom, what can I do online to bring curriculum to life in a different modality? And that's what we do really well as educators and leaders. And then feedback. How do I share that feedback? I, as a researcher, as many of you, the concept is theory to practice. And so how do we support student comprehension, their application, and most importantly, transfer of learning, looking at positive transfer, near transfer, far transfer. And when we look at accreditation, when we look at federal regulations, everything needs to align with our student learning outcomes. So based on that, we have an opportunity to stop. And we need to find ways to integrate metacognition into our everyday lives. Sometimes we're so busy, we don't even have time to think about our own thinking. I will say with all of the classes that I teach, my first week in our orientation, I tell them, not only will you meet the stated learning outcomes for this course, we're going to talk about metacognition. You will be engaged in metacognition throughout the course, and it's going to start right now with awareness. You need to be aware of your strengths and your gaps. I never talk about weaknesses because as we start to look at the brain and we look at neuronal connections, one of the things that you're going to see is it's all about making sure you have connections. So when we talk about pivoting and learning, one of the things we have to think about collectively, and I encourage you, please share this information with fellow educators, is we have to look at cognitive load. When students have too much or employees have too much, it can affect the brain. And when you look at toxic stress and the effects stress has on the brain, we're in the midst of a pandemic, it can actually change the architecture of the brain and change the hippocampus, the amygdala. And so we need to look at how we balance instruction, content, assessment, engagement, and feedback. We don't simply put it up, but we have to really be strategic. So how do we take this engaged classroom and make sure it does not look like this for our students, for our parents, for our educators? We need to make sure that we're thinking, what is this balance? And we need to quantify it. We need to look at how we balance all of these, because in a classroom, there is so much that is happening. Outside of the classroom, we have that dynamic of homework and preparation, but once it's all online, it becomes almost blurred. So the stronger the base in terms of understanding how the human process works, the better. So when we look at the brain, and I'm going to share this with you, when you leave this presentation, I'm hoping one of the things you're going to take with you is a concept of neuroplasticity. And what you're seeing here right now is a neuron. It is probably the most exciting thing in the world as an educator. I went back to school to Johns Hopkins University about 6 years ago and enrolled in their mind-brain teaching program. And it was amazing. It affirmed so much of what I knew, but hadn't really aligned some of the theory to practice. And it challenged my beliefs and assumptions. In fact, it helped me debunk some of the things we're going to talk about. But what you see on the left are going to be dendrites. And when students are in an engaging classroom and they have lots of sensory information, they have visual materials, auditory types of materials, they're engaged in lots of really dynamic experiences, information travels down this axon to axon terminals and it starts to connect. And when it connects, what happens is you form memories. Well, Dr. Shauna Sapiro says, what you practice grows stronger. I wish I had like an hour to go over this because I could show many, many fun videos on this. But one of the things you're going to see is a myelin sheath that is coding this axon. And look at how much faster the impulse is getting processed. And it goes back to practice. What you practice grows stronger. So I'm going to do a quick activity. It is a wonderful short poll, and it's going to be a Zoom poll. I'm going to bring it up in just 1 second, and you're going to answer these questions. So we're going to look at it. You're just going to answer correct, incorrect, or I don't know. A primary indicator of dyslexia is seeing letters backwards. Individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning styles. Some of us are left-brained and some of us are right-brained due to Hemisphere Dominance, and this helps explain differences in how we learn. We only use 10% of our brain. Differentiated instruction is individualized instruction. And then the last three, information studied over longer periods of time is better remembered than the same information studied over shorter periods of time. The last two, universal design for learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn and then human memory. It works much like a digital recording device or video camera in that it accurately records the events we experience. So right now, you should see the poll. And I'm hoping you can go into the poll and you can scroll up and down to answer these questions. So just answer it, correct, incorrect, or I don't know. So we're going to start here, and I'm hoping that it is visible for all of you. Perfect. Oh, good. I said nodding head. We won't have anybody linked to their response. So just select, and then we'll look collectively at the responses coming in. Okay, I can see we've got some responses coming. And there is a scroll bar that you can scroll down to see all of the questions. So I'll give it another minute because I know there's a lot of questions on there. And then we'll talk about the questions. So we're at about 50% completion. So we'll give it just a little longer and then I'll share the results and then we'll go through the research. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to end the poll here. If you're not done that, perfect, wonderful. So this is what the responses were, and then we're going to talk about them. So the majority of individuals in this session have indicated incorrect for dyslexia with the primary indicator reading letters backwards. There's a 50-50 split with learning styles. With right brain, left brain, the majority said incorrect. 10% of our brain, the majority said incorrect. Differentiated instruction, the majority incorrect. Another split with information being studied over a long period of time. UDL, the majority correct, and then a split. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the presentation and share the answers. Everything that you just saw is based on an international study that we conducted. We sent out a survey that was developed over a period of a year with different neuroscientists, psychologists, learning scientists. We ended up with about 1,200 responses, of which 929 met the criteria for inclusion. They included faculty, instructional designers, and professional development administrators. And we looked at common neuromyths, general knowledge about the brain, and evidence-based practices. And this started because in K through 12, if you look at the literature, there is a high level of susceptibility to believing neuromyths. And so we decided, where is this coming from? Is it happening, within higher education? And the challenge is, within higher education, faculty often work in teams. So what if a faculty member doesn't have a specific theory that they're using, but an instructional designer says, hey, this is a great idea. Did you know if you do this, it'll increase learning? Well, all of a sudden you have shared information, but it may not be accurate. Same with professional development. And I'll share something in terms of one of my experiences. We looked at professional development and did it make a difference? We looked at interest in learning more about the brain. There's an entire section of this report, section 7, that answers all of the questions on the survey instruments. And it took another 6 months to write with our team to make sure that everything was in terminology that would be easily understood. So I'm going to share the responses so you can see what we found. So the first two are incorrect. And what did we find? This is % correct. So out of the approximate 1,000 participants, 23% of the instructors got this answer correct. 27% of instructional designers got it correct, and 24% of the administrators. So they either said it was incorrect or they didn't know. And so this, as an educator, is a great way to look at opportunity. How do we educate our higher education population into the correct information? Individuals learn better when they receive information in the preferred learning styles. Incorrect. And again, you're going to look at the percentage of those who got it correct. All three of these are incorrect. And you're going to see that a lot of the respondents were simply unaware or perhaps had incorrect understanding. When we look at information studied over periods of longer time in UDL, these are correct, and then human memory working like a recording device is incorrect. And I will tell you, if you look at instructional designers, their percentages are slightly higher, in some cases much higher, but a lot of their training focuses on pedagogy and theory to practice. I say that because in higher education, sometimes our faculty have incredible expertise, but may not have that pedagogical foundation that someone in K through 12 might have. Now, why is this important? Because of mindset. The literature shows that an educator's conceptualization of knowledge greatly impacts his or her pedagogy and can affect a learner's epistemological beliefs. Now, is this true? There have been people that have debated this, but I will tell you, I was a K through 12 teacher. I studied back in the early 1990s, and one of the training courses that I took was on how to teach the learning styles. And I used it in my classroom because that's what I was taught. And we're going to look at what the research shows. So we're going to talk about neuromyths. These are misconceptions. Wonderful information out there, but somehow it's either being presented incorrectly or maybe somebody's misunderstood them. Tracy Tokuhama Spinoza, who's done lots of research on this, states that this actually can do harm. Why? Well, when we look at dyslexia, one of the researchers on our international studies looking at neuromyths and evidence-based practices just came out with a recent article a couple of weeks ago, and she talks about this neuromyth. And she says the myth of backwards reading is particularly pernicious because it leads to a fundamental misunderstanding of the cause of the disorder. And it also interferes with best practices. So it is very complex. There's a great article that I'll include in the references, but it's important not to simply make that assumption that dyslexia is simply reading letters backwards. Individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning styles. This is probably the #1 neuromyth that is out there internationally. Why should we not use learning styles? Well, it's been linked to functional fixedness, and this would be a cognitive bias. And I say this because from the time I was young, I was told I was a visual learner. Well, I also taught Spanish. So if I assess students and I said, Larry, you are definitely a visual learner. Well, what would Larry do? Larry would probably seek out lots of content that were visual related, and he's going to study that content. And what did Dr. Shapiro say? What you practice grows stronger. So he inevitably is going to get really good at the materials that he's studying, especially in that format. And what's going to happen when I have my oral exam? He might panic. He might have this functional fixedness that says, I can't do this. Or maybe when he's working in groups, he just says, I don't think we can do that. We better do something visual. So we need to think about this concept of growth mindsets and fixed mindsets. Why do we know it's important? Well, you've probably seen the work of Carol Dweck, but at Harvard University, they did a study and they published the results in 2019. They took 12,500 ninth graders and they did an intervention. And they basically said in the intervention, intelligence is not fixed. It is not innate. And you heard Dr. Kaufman talk about interventions. And what happened with these students? New mindset, new results. These students had significantly higher GPAs at a year that would be considered a risk year. And they said that both the higher and lower achieving students increased the likelihood of pursuing advanced mathematics in 10th grade based on an intervention that affected mindset. Some of us are left brain, some of us are right brain due to hemispheric dominance. Definitely incorrect. Where does this come from? There's amazing research out there that does talk about hemispheric function. The Alzheimer's Association shows that the left hemisphere controls what happens on the right side of the body. The right hemisphere controls what happens on the left hemisphere. What we know is there are certain activities and certain function related to each side of the hemisphere, but we want to make sure when we're talking about learning that we're talking about actively engaging students in that mindset that they are using their entire brain. This concept of using 10% of the brain, there's all sorts of urban legend. I've heard that it was related to Einstein and supposedly an interview where he actually said, could you imagine if humans used more than 10% of the brain, what we'd be capable of? There's lots of other legends that are out there, but what do educators need to know? Well, when you look at a positron emission tomography scan, what happens in the brain? And I want you to think about right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and 10%. This is what a PET scan shows when you're reading. So even when students may look like, oh my gosh, they've got a blank stare, maybe they're not getting it, their brain is highly active. Look at what happens when they're thinking about a word, saying a word. So there is so much activity happening, even when it looks like students are just sat there in the classroom. So what do we know about the brain? And this is what I want everybody to leave with, this concept of neuroplasticity. When you look at the Greek word neuro, nerve, and plastos, our brains change continuously in response to actions and experiences. And that's what we do as educators and trainers. What I want you to do is listen to what one researcher shares about the brain in a short video. I want to make sure also that we understand the brain isn't a muscle. So you often hear, I've got to commit it to muscle memory. Well, the brain is an organ. And what is so exciting is research shows that we have 100 billion neurons, over 100 trillion synaptic connections. And so when we again think about, by the time you leave this presentation, your brain won't be the same because of the information that you're processing. And the more you practice something, the stronger that connection. So I want you to listen to this short little video by Dr. Laura Boyd and what she has to say about neuroplasticity.
It's an amazing time to be a brain researcher, and I would argue to you that I have the most interesting job in the world. What we know about the brain is changing at a breathtaking pace. And much of what we thought we knew and understood about the brain turns out to be not true or incomplete. Now, some of these misconceptions are more obvious than others. For example, we used to think that after childhood, the brain really could not change. And it turns out that nothing could be farther from the truth. Another misconception about the brain is that you only use parts of it at any given time and it's silent when you do nothing. Well, this is also untrue. It turns out that even when you're at rest and thinking of nothing, your brain is highly active. So it's been advances in technology such as MRI has allowed us to make these and many other important discoveries. And perhaps the most exciting, the most interesting and transformative of these discoveries is that every time you learn a new fact or skill, you change your brain. It's something we call neuroplasticity. So as little as 25 years ago, we thought that after about puberty, the only changes that took place in the brain were negative. The loss of brain cells with aging, the result of damage like a stroke. And then studies began to show remarkable amounts of reorganization in the adult brain. And the ensuing research has shown us that all of our behaviors change our brain, that these changes are not limited by age. It's good news, right? And in fact, they're taking place all the time. And very importantly, brain reorganization helps to support recovery after you damage your brain. The key to each of these changes is neuroplasticity.
So I'm going to stop that video and I'm going to share just a little more and then we'll wrap up. Dr. Laura Boyd said, in terms of the brain, it changes every time you learn a new fact or skill in response to a change in the real world or new experience. When students say, gosh, I'm not smart, I'm not good at, and I have this, even in my classes on the master's or doctoral level, oh gosh, I'm not good at statistics because I wasn't good at math. I tell them, you know what? I don't believe it. It's a gap. It's something where either maybe you don't have the prior learning and you weren't introduced, maybe you learned it incorrectly, or maybe you just haven't made that connection. And so trying to talk to students, in all of my classes, I tell them, we're going to talk about neuroplasticity because your brain will change during the next 10 weeks. Alvin Toffler, who's a futurist, says, by instructing students how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, a powerful new dimension can be added to education. I think my favorite comments on evaluations are, Dr. Betts, thank you for a dynamic course. I now realize I have so much more to learn. And that's what learning is. So when we look at evidence-based practices, differentiated instruction is individualized instruction. No, it is not an IEP, but it's pedagogy. How do we take a dynamic assignment and integrate choice? So if I'm teaching a course and I happen to have students in HRD, nursing, administration for K through 12 and higher ed, how can I make sure that all of these students are meeting the same student learning outcomes? Well, we've got high quality curriculum, we've got the same assessments, tasks that are challenging, collectively building on this interdisciplinary dynamic, flexible grouping, teaching up, but I can take all of these students, have the same assignment, the same rubric, the same directions, but they can choose the topic in which they're going to study. They can choose sometimes, depending on the assignment, most of my work is in advanced writing, but if they're doing a reflection, they can choose an application of their choice. And what does this do? It helps them all be successful with that knowledge and skill set across all of their disciplines. Lastly, information that's studied over longer periods of time is remembered. Well, yes, but we've got to make sure that we provide time for studying. One of the things we do, especially moving things online as educators, what do? We add more readings, more videos, more discussion boards, more Zoom sessions. But we're not thinking about cognition. We're not thinking about the human learning process. When do students have time for learning? When are they studying? When are they writing? When are they practicing? When are they reflecting? When are they even having a chance to be creative? So we need to think about, how are we integrating retrieval practice, space practice, elaboration, interleaving, metacognition, growth mindset, and all of this is available through different institutions that you can access, but we have to make sure students have time to learn. What did we find out? What you practice grows stronger, and students need quality time to practice. So lastly, Universal Design for Learning, we're gonna finish with a great activity. UDL is a framework that builds upon the human learning process. You're looking at the affective network, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, that motivation, recognition, how you present your content. If everything is reading and video, maybe your students won't get it, who might need an infographic or need to work in small groups and hear it presented differently. Or the strategic network, how are you testing them? Low stakes assessments, different assignments, different ways they can share their information. So it's going back to engagement, the motivation, the why. They choose their topic, now it's got relevance. The recognition network, different modalities. This presentation has video, it has text. We're going to do some engaging small little tasks before we wrap up. But how do you reinforce that connection we were talking about and increase the myelin sheath? When we look at action and expression, again, could it be discussions, low stakes quizzes, papers, reflections? Cass states there is no average brain. Variability is the dominant feature of the nervous system. Like fingerprints, no two brains are alike. Each brain is complex, interconnected web that is sculpted and influenced by genetics and interactions. And that is what we are doing as educators. The challenge is students assume this is what success looks like. This is what success looks like. And we need to tell them, you know what learning looks like? No, it's not just writing a paper and thinking you're going to get an A. Learning is messy. It's creative. And we have to help students understand that's what's going to foster these connections. So when we look at neurodiversity, it's not just our students, but it's us as educators collectively at this conference. It looks at the diversity of human brains and minds, and it says, this is a natural and valuable form of diversity. So I'm going to do a quick activity. I want you to post into the chat, and then we're going to wrap up, what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Just put in your chat. If you see, I don't know what you see. I don't want to give anything away or bias things. Just type in your chat what you see. And I'm hoping you have access. So just open up your chat and tell me what you might see in there. Two faces. So a vase and two faces. Anybody? So someone sees the vase first and then the two faces. Anybody see anything else? So I've been doing a number of workshops over the last couple of weeks. I will tell you, I've had chalices, candlesticks, bird baths, you name it. Some people don't see the faces at all. Some people see, okay, a goblet. See one face, if they look at the face on the left, they can't see the one on the right. But when we talk about universal design, what happens if I take away the color? Something so simple. Now all of a sudden you may say, it's harder to see what I saw before, but the faces are very pronounced. How about here? What do you see on the left? Where is the red ball? Is it in the back of the cube or is it in the front of the cube? So when we talk about preferences, what you see first would be your preference, but keep looking at it. Keep looking at the red ball and see if it moves to the front. Once mine moves to the front, it's really hard to see it move to the back. So see if you're able. So Ronaldo saw it in the back first. Okay, then he saw it go to the front. Somebody else saw it in the front first. So you can see this shift. How about the ballerina here? Is she spinning clockwise or counterclockwise? Or does she move intermittently? Does she go clockwise and then counterclockwise? Can you see both? So Larry sees both. I have never seen it go counterclockwise, ever. And I've been doing this for years. Melissa sees both. People have told me, focus on the arms, focus on the leg. Nothing helps. Last two, what color is the dress? Is it blue and black, white and gold, gold and blue? I will tell you, I've had people that have seen purple and brown. I've had people see colors that haven't even been options. So we've got a lot of blue and black. Anybody else? Blue and brown? Periwinkle and brown? Anybody with white and gold or gold and blue? Just curious. White and gold. So here we are as a group of educators, and we're seeing the same thing but differently. Last thing, you can see the number 16 on the left. What do you see in A? Do you see a number at all in A? A 2. Perfect. How about B? A 5, a 6. Anybody else? How about C? 7. Last one, D. So what if I were to tell you, I see nothing. I only see color. I don't see a single number. I have something that looks like it could be a circle, a D, but I see absolutely no numbers at all. And so when we look at this, we need to think about our students, and this is the neurodiversity. This is the collective experiences that we're talking about. So human memory is not a video recorder. It's constructed. And as educators, we need to bring forth this creativity lens and let students know you may be seeing things differently because of genetics, because of your experience, because of prior learning, but we can help you in terms of moving forward in really learning more about the brain and neuroplasticity, because the brain is not fixed. Last part of the studies, training was a great predictor of awareness. Those who attended training related to mind-brain education, psychology, and neuroscience had higher awareness of neuromyths, information about the brain and evidence-based practices. Those who read had higher levels of awareness as well. And lastly, there was unsubstantially high levels of interest in learning more about the brain. So everything we've done has been a hidden lesson. Everything I've done has introduced you to mind-brain education science, the principles of mind-brain education science, human brains being unique, brains actually being differently prepared as they come into your classroom, learning being influenced by prior learning, the brain changing through experience, neuroplasticity, and there is no learning without attention and memory. So that is it. I want to leave this by saying you are all brain changers. It is such an exciting time to be in education and training.